Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that should come with a warning label, an informed consent form, and possibly a hazard suit. Effexor, the antidepressant that psychiatrists themselves whisper about like it's cursed. Not because it doesn't work, it works fine. The problem is getting off it, which some patients and doctors alike have compared to trying to break up with someone who nailed your windows shut and reprogrammed your nervous system on the way out. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. Your comment is the reason we're here tonight, and honestly this channel only grows because people like you keep pointing us toward the stories worth telling. We're also officially on Spotify now, so if audio-only sleep listening is more your thing, there's a link in the description. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, and get comfortable, because we're about to ask some very uncomfortable questions. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like when a chemical decides it doesn't want to leave your body quietly? Have you ever heard of brain zaps and thought that sounded like a video game power-up instead of a withdrawal symptom? Did you know a medication could make quitting caffeine look like a spa day by comparison? Would you have taken this pill if you'd known the exit door was bolted shut behind you? And now, congratulations, you've just been prescribed Effexor. The year is 1993, the FDA has just approved it, and nobody, not the doctors, not the company, not you, has any idea what's coming. Every antidepressant before this one played by the same rules: nudge serotonin, wait a month, hope for the best. Then a group of chemists at Wyeth decided the rules were boring. What they built instead was something that grabbed not just serotonin but norepinephrine too, a double-fisted approach to brain chemistry that nobody had really attempted at scale. It sounded like progress. It sounded like the future of psychiatry. Nobody in that lab was thinking about the word withdrawal yet, because why would they be? You don't design the lock before you've even built the door. Picture the pitch meeting. A room full of very smart people in 1980s. Lab coats, staring at molecular diagrams, congratulating themselves on cracking a problem that had stumped the industry for decades. Depression wasn't just a serotonin problem, they realized. It was a serotonin and norepinephrine problem, a two-headed beast that needed a two-pronged solution. This was genuinely clever chemistry. It's the kind of insight that wins awards, gets published in journals nobody outside the field will ever read, and eventually turns into a pill bottle sitting in someone's medicine cabinet in Ohio. The compound itself, venlafaxine, moved through the research pipeline with the quiet confidence of something that tested well. Early trials showed it worked, and worked for people who hadn't responded to anything else, the treatment-resistant cases, the ones who'd cycled through 3 or 4 other medications with nothing but side effects to show for it. For these patients, Effexor wasn't just another option. It was for many the first thing that actually lifted the fog. That success story is real, and it matters, and it's worth remembering before we spend the next several hours cataloguing everything that went wrong on the way out the door. But here's the thing about dual-action mechanisms. What makes them powerful going in tends to make them complicated coming out. Your brain doesn't just adjust to a chemical, it renegotiates its entire operating structure around it, quietly, patiently, over months and years, the way a plant grows around a fence post until you can't tell anymore which shape belongs to which. Effexor didn't just occupy one type of receptor, it occupied 2, and asked your brain to recalibrate along 2 axes simultaneously. Nobody in that lab in the 80s was running the experiment on what happens when you ask a brain to recalibrate back. This is the quiet irony sitting underneath the entire Effexor story. The exact feature that made it clinically remarkable. The dual mechanism, the broader netcast across brain chemistry, is the same feature that would later make it one of the hardest antidepressants in existence to stop taking. Nobody planned this outcome maliciously. Nobody sat in that boardroom twirling a moustache, plotting decades of brain zaps. It was simply the natural, unexamined consequence of solving one problem so thoroughly that a different, quieter problem got built in for free, like a warranty nobody read the fine print on. By the time Effexor was ready for approval, the research had answered the question everyone was asking: does this work? Nobody in the room was yet asking the second question, the one patients would end up asking themselves at 2 a.m. years later, staring at the ceiling with their skull buzzing faintly like a dying fluorescent light. What happens when I try to leave? That question would take years and thousands of confused, frightened patients to fully answer. And when the answer finally came, it turned out to be considerably less clean than the chemistry that started it all. You're living through the early 90s, a time of dial-up modems and the belief that anything approved by a federal agency must be, at minimum, reasonably safe to leave your body the same way it entered it. The FDA looks at Effexor, looks at the trial data and says, yes, go ahead, prescribe this. Doctors are thrilled. Here, finally, is a drug that treats depression and anxiety with a mechanism nobody else has cornered. Nobody at this party is checking the exits, because nobody has been told there might be a fire later. The approval process itself was, by the standards of the time, thorough. Clinical trials measured efficacy, measured common side effects, measured the things regulators had learned to measure from decades of prior antidepressants. What those trials were not particularly built to measure was long-term discontinuation, because discontinuation wasn't yet understood to be its own distinct clinical event worth its own dedicated study. You test whether a drug works. You test whether it's dangerous while you're on it. The question of what happens when you get off it was treated at the time as a footnote rather than a headline, an assumption baked into the entire field rather than a specific oversight anyone can be individually blamed for. Once approved, Effexor entered a market hungry for exactly what it offered. Prozac had already made SSRIs a household concept, and doctors were comfortable prescribing antidepressants in a way that would have seemed radical a decade earlier. Effexor slotted into this newly normalized landscape as the next logical step, a drug for the patients SSRIs hadn't quite reached. Psychiatric offices across the country began writing prescriptions with the same confidence they'd apply to antibiotics, a course of treatment with a beginning, a middle and an end whenever the patient and doctor decided the end had arrived. Nobody was wrong to feel optimistic. For a meaningful population of patients, particularly those with treatment-resistant depression, Effexor delivered results that felt close to miraculous after years of medications that simply hadn't worked. The excitement in psychiatric circles was genuine, and in many respects, earned. This was a drug doing exactly what it was designed to do, lifting a fog that other medications had failed to touch. If the story stopped here, in 1993, with an approval and a wave of grateful patients, it would be a tidy, uncomplicated success story, the kind pharmaceutical companies put in their annual reports with a small congratulatory graphic. But medicine rarely stays tidy for long, and the story of any drug is really the story of what happens across years, not months. Somewhere out there, among the thousands of patients starting Effexor in that first year of approval, a small number were about to become the earliest and least prepared test subjects for a phenomenon that hadn't yet earned its name. They would miss a dose because of a delayed pharmacy refill, or a vacation that ran a day longer than expected, and they would feel something strange happen inside their own skull. A jolt, a buzz, a sensation with no obvious cause and no obvious explanation. They would call their doctor, describe it as best they could, and receive, in most cases, a shrug. Because in 1993 there was no name for what was happening to them yet. There was just confusion on both sides of the exam room desk, and a slowly accumulating body of anecdotes that would eventually force the entire medical establishment to catch up to what patients already knew from experience. It's easy, looking back with decades of hindsight, to feel a certain frustration at how slowly this recognition unfolded, and that frustration is entirely fair. But it's worth remembering how approval processes were structured at the time, built around measurable short-term clinical trial windows rather than the kind of long-term, real-world tracking that would eventually reveal the full discontinuation picture. 1993 simply wasn't equipped, institutionally or culturally, to catch this particular problem before it reached patients. That gap wouldn't close for years, and closing it would require exactly the kind of patient-driven persistence this entire story keeps circling back to. Wyeth did not need to shout about Effexor, because doctors were already whispering about it to each other, the good kind of whisper, the kind reserved for a drug that seems to actually work when others have failed. Sales representatives visited offices with pamphlets full of hope and mechanism diagrams. Nobody was handing out pamphlets about what happens when you stop. That conversation, it turns out, would arrive later, uninvited, and considerably less polite. Pharmaceutical marketing in the 90s operated on a fairly simple principle: emphasize the mechanism, emphasize the results, and let the enthusiasm of prescribing physicians do the rest of the advertising for you, informally, over coffee, in hospital break rooms and at continuing education conferences. Effexor's marketing leaned heavily into its novelty, the dual action mechanism, the treatment-resistant success stories, the sense that this was meaningfully different from the SSRIs that had dominated the previous decade. And it was different. That much was true. The marketing wasn't lying about the mechanism, it was simply silent about the exit. Sales representatives, it's worth remembering, were not chemists or psychiatrists. They were trained on talking points developed by people whose job was to get physicians excited about writing prescriptions, not to anticipate every possible downstream consequence of a molecule's half-life. If discontinuation difficulty wasn't yet flagged as a significant concern internally, it certainly wasn't going to appear on a glossy trifold pamphlet left on a doctor's desk between patient visits. The information gap wasn't necessarily a conspiracy. It was simply the natural result of a system that rewarded speed to market and enthusiasm over patient, unglamorous, long-term data collection. Doctors, for their part, absorbed this enthusiasm and passed it along to patients with the same confidence they'd apply to any other well-reviewed medication. Here's something that might help where other things haven't. Try it for a few months. See how you feel. This was, and remains, entirely reasonable medical advice for beginning a treatment. What it lacked was any meaningful conversation about what beginning that treatment might eventually cost when the time came to stop, because nobody handing out the pamphlets had yet been given a reason to think that conversation was necessary. The gap between marketing enthusiasm and patient experience widened slowly, almost invisibly over the following years. Patients started the drug, felt better, stayed on it for the recommended duration, and eventually, for one reason or another, tried to stop. Some transitioned smoothly. Others encountered something the pamphlets had never mentioned, something with no name, no diagnostic code, and no acknowledgement in the literature their doctor had been trained on. They weren't imagining it. They were simply ahead of the paperwork, living through a phenomenon that medicine hadn't yet built the vocabulary to describe, using drugs marketed with an enthusiasm that had quietly outpaced the evidence about what would happen when the prescription finally ran its course. This is, in fairness, how pharmaceutical marketing has generally operated across the entire history of the industry, front-loading enthusiasm for what a drug does well, while treating the exit process as a secondary, less urgent concern to be addressed only once it becomes unavoidable. Effexor wasn't unique in this pattern. What made it notable was simply the scale of the gap between the enthusiasm at the front end and the difficulty eventually discovered at the back end, a gap wide enough that it couldn't stay quiet in the whisper network forever, and would eventually, however slowly, force its way into the louder, more formal conversation medicine was reluctant to have. Your brain runs on chemical messengers, and two of the most important ones for mood are serotonin and norepinephrine. Most antidepressants of the era picked one and stuck with it, faithfully, monogamously. Effexor decided monogamy was for lesser drugs and went after both, an SNRI in a world still mostly running on SSRIs. This dual action made it more effective for some patients, particularly those whose depression hadn't budged for anything else. It also meant your brain would need to recalibrate twice as much once the drug ever tried to leave. Think of serotonin and norepinephrine as two separate departments in the enormous, chronically understaffed office that is your brain. Serotonin handles mood regulation, a broad and somewhat vague job description covering everything from general contentment to appetite to sleep quality. Norepinephrine handles alertness, energy, and the fight-or-flight response, a department that's usually fairly busy even on a calm day. Most SSRIs walk into the serotonin department, adjust a few settings, and leave the norepinephrine department alone entirely. Effexor walks into both departments on the same visit, which is efficient and also means both departments now have to adjust to a new normal simultaneously. At low doses, Effexor behaves mostly like an SSRI, working primarily on serotonin. As the dose increases, its effect on norepinephrine becomes more pronounced, which is part of why doctors could fine-tune it for different symptom profiles. A lower dose for patients who needed mood support, a higher dose for patients who also needed help with energy and focus. This dose-dependent flexibility was, for a long time, considered one of the drug's genuine strengths, a dial rather than a switch, allowing psychiatrists to titrate treatment with a level of precision that felt almost bespoke compared to the one-size-fits-all feel of earlier medications. But dials that go up smoothly don't always come down smoothly, and this is really the crux of the entire Effexor story before we've even gotten to the withdrawal chapters. A brain that has spent months or years adjusting its own receptor sensitivity around two separate neurotransmitter systems doesn't simply flip back to its original settings the moment the pill disappears. It has to renegotiate both systems again in reverse, often at a pace dictated by how quickly the drug itself clears from the bloodstream rather than any pace the brain would actually prefer. Two systems means twice the renegotiation, and renegotiation, as anyone who has been through a contentious lease dispute can tell you, rarely goes quickly or comfortably. None of this made Effexor a bad drug. For plenty of patients, the dual mechanism was precisely what allowed them to function again after years of feeling like nothing worked. The chemistry did its job, admirably, exactly as designed. The complication was never really about whether the drug worked while you were taking it. The complication was always waiting patiently on the other end, in the exit, in the eventual and often inevitable moment when a patient and their doctor decided it was time to see what life looked like without it. And that moment, as we're about to explore, tended to arrive with a great deal more drama than anyone had been led to expect. Here's a fun bit of pharmacology that nobody explains at the pharmacy counter. Effexor has one of the shortest half-lives of any major antidepressant, meaning it exits your bloodstream fast, much faster than something like Prozac, which lingers around for weeks like a houseguest who forgot they were only staying the weekend. A short half-life sounds efficient. In practice, it means your brain barely gets a grace period before the chemical is gone, and the withdrawal clock starts ticking, sometimes within hours of a missed dose. Half-life, for anyone who slept through that particular chemistry lecture, refers to the time it takes for half of a drug's concentration to clear from your system, Effexor's half-life sits at somewhere around 5 hours for the parent compound, occasionally extending a bit longer once you account for its active metabolite, but even generously measured, this is remarkably short. Prozac, by contrast, has a half-life measured in days, and its active metabolite can linger for weeks. This difference sounds like a minor technical footnote. It is, in practice, the single biggest reason Effexor earned its fearsome withdrawal reputation, while other antidepressants managed to avoid quite so much infamy. Imagine two people leaving the same party. One lingers at the door for an hour, saying slow goodbyes, letting everyone adjust gradually to their eventual absence. The other simply vanishes the moment the clock strikes midnight, leaving the room to suddenly notice they're gone all at once. Prozac is the lingerer, Effexor is the vanisher. Your brain, having spent months adjusting its receptor sensitivity around a steady supply of the drug, suddenly finds that supply cut dramatically within a single day, sometimes within hours of a missed or delayed dose, with no gradual off-ramp built into the chemistry itself. This is why patients on Effexor learned, often through unpleasant trial and error, that missing even a single dose could trigger symptoms within 12 to 24 hours, a timeline considerably faster than most other antidepressants. A forgotten pill on a busy morning, a delayed pharmacy refill, a vacation where the suitcase somehow didn't make it onto the plane. Any of these mundane, universally relatable mishaps could translate into brain zaps and dizziness by dinner time, a consequence entirely disproportionate to the size of the mistake that caused it. The cruel irony here is that this same short half-life, which made discontinuation so abrupt, is partly why the drug works so well for some patients in the first place, providing a fairly steady and predictable presence in the bloodstream throughout the day when taken as prescribed. The very consistency that made it effective medicine made it merciless medicine to leave. Pharmacologists understood this trade-off reasonably well from early on. Patients, largely, did not, at least not until they experienced it directly, usually through exactly the kind of ordinary scheduling hiccup that happens to nearly everyone at some point, and learned the hard way that this particular drug did not believe in grace periods. Somewhere in the mid-90s, patients started reporting something strange happening when they missed a dose, even by a few hours. A jolt, a zap, a feeling like their brain had briefly short-circuited and rebooted. These weren't people trying to quit the medication entirely. These were people who simply run late refilling a prescription. Doctors, largely unfamiliar with this pattern, often chalked it up to anxiety or coincidence. The pattern, as it turned out, was neither. Imagine being one of these early patients. You've been taking your medication faithfully for months, feeling better than you have in years, and then one Tuesday the pharmacy is out of stock, or your insurance flags a refill for review, or you simply lose track of the date. By that evening, something happens that you have no words for, a flicker behind your eyes, a static-like buzz that seems to travel from your skull down through your shoulders. You call your doctor the next morning, describe it as best you can, and are met with a puzzled pause on the other end of the line. There's no box to check for this. There's no diagnostic code that fits neatly. The doctor, not being dismissive so much as simply unequipped, suggests it might be stress, or perhaps the return of the original anxiety symptoms, and recommends you get back on schedule with your dose. For a while, this was the entire medical response available. Get back on schedule, because getting back on schedule did, reliably, make the sensation disappear. This created an unintentional trap. The fix worked so well and so quickly that it discouraged deeper investigation. If taking the pill again makes the strange zapping sensation go away within hours, doctors reasoned, then clearly the solution is simply to keep taking the pill, rather than to investigate why missing it caused the problem in the first place. This logic wasn't unreasonable given the information available at the time. It also happened to be exactly the kind of logic that delays a proper diagnosis by years. Patient anecdotes, though, have a way of accumulating even when the official literature hasn't caught up. Word spread slowly between people taking the same medication, sometimes through support groups originally organised around depression or anxiety rather than around the drug itself. Someone would mention the zaps almost in passing, expecting blank stares, and instead find an entire room of people nodding in immediate relieved recognition. Oh, you get those too. This quiet, informal cross-referencing among patients, long before anyone had built a proper name or a proper study around the phenomenon, was in many ways the earliest real data collection on Effexor withdrawal, assembled not by researchers with clipboards, but by ordinary people comparing notes because nobody else was doing it for them. By the time enough of these anecdotes accumulated to catch the attention of the broader psychiatric community, years had already passed, years during which countless patients experienced these symptoms in isolation, assuming something was uniquely wrong with them individually, rather than understanding it as a predictable, mechanistic consequence of the drug's short half-life interacting with a missed dose. The delay wasn't due to any single villain deliberately withholding information. It was simply how slowly institutional medicine tends to move when the evidence arrives first through scattered patient experience, rather than through a controlled study with a tidy conclusion section. Patients had been living the answer for years before medicine got around to asking the right question. If you've never experienced a brain zap, count yourself fortunate, because the people who have described it with the kind of specificity usually reserved for trauma, a jolt behind the eyes, a buzz that shoots down the spine, a sensation like your brain briefly glitched and someone yanked the plug and shoved it back in. Nobody has ever fully explained the neurological mechanism behind this. What we do know is that it happens overwhelmingly with Effexor and its chemical cousins, and once you've had one, you will do almost anything to avoid having another. The leading theory, and it remains a theory rather than a settled fact, involves the sudden drop in serotonin and norepinephrine activity, disrupting the brain's electrical signalling in ways that manifest as this brief, sharp, sensory glitch. Some researchers have compared it loosely to a kind of micro-seizure activity, though this comparison tends to alarm patients more than it clarifies anything, and it's worth being careful with that language given how much unnecessary fear it can generate. Others suggest it may relate to disrupted eye movement signalling, since many patients report the sensation is triggered or worsened specifically when moving their eyes quickly from side to side, an oddly specific detail that shows up again and again across thousands of separate patient descriptions. What makes brain zaps particularly unsettling isn't just the sensation itself, unpleasant as it is, but the complete absence of any visible cause. You can't point to it on an MRI. You can't measure it with a blood test. It leaves no trace for a doctor to examine after the fact, which means the entire clinical relationship rests on trusting a patient's subjective description of something that sounds, frankly, a little unbelievable to anyone who hasn't experienced it themselves. Try explaining to a skeptical coworker that your brain occasionally makes a static electric popping sensation, and watch their face carefully. It's not an easy sell, even when you're not exaggerating even slightly. Patients developed their own informal vocabulary for the episodes long before medicine offered any official terminology, a testament to how much the affected community had to build entirely on their own. Brain shivers, brain shocks, the zap. Some described a whooshing sound accompanying the sensation, an internal noise nobody else could hear, timed precisely with the jolt itself. Others reported the zaps intensifying during specific triggers, stress, sudden movement, even something as mundane as sneezing. A detail that sounds almost comedic until you remember these patients were dealing with dozens of these episodes daily during the worst stretches of withdrawal. Eventually, as awareness grew, brain zaps became one of the most commonly cited hallmark symptoms of SNRI discontinuation specifically. a kind of grim signature that distinguished this drug class from milder discontinuation experiences associated with other antidepressants. They rarely cause lasting physical harm, which is at least a small mercy, but the psychological toll of experiencing an unpredictable, unexplainable, neurological glitch multiple times a day for weeks or months should not be understated. It is, by every patient account available, thoroughly miserable and remains one of the strangest, least understood symptoms in all of modern psychiatric medicine, a mystery hiding in plain sight inside the skulls of millions of people who simply wanted to stop taking a pill. For years, the pharmaceutical industry preferred the term discontinuation syndrome to withdrawal, a linguistic sleight of hand that suggested something mild, temporary, almost courteous. Discontinuation syndrome sounds like ending a magazine subscription. What patients were actually experiencing sounded considerably less like a magazine subscription, and considerably more like a small nervous system rebellion. The semantics mattered because insurance companies, doctors, and patients themselves needed a word that didn't sound like the drug had a hostage situation clause built in. The word withdrawal carries a specific cultural weight, tied historically to substances with clear addictive potential: opioids, alcohol, benzodiazepines. Pharmaceutical companies, understandably protective of a drug's reputation, had strong incentive to avoid that particular word appearing anywhere near their product literature, even when the symptoms patients described bore an uncomfortable resemblance to what anyone would call withdrawal if it happened with a different substance. Discontinuation syndrome offered a tidy linguistic escape hatch, technically accurate in the driest clinical sense, while carrying none of the baggage that might make a physician hesitate before prescribing, or a patient hesitate before agreeing to start. This distinction wasn't purely cosmetic, though the effect on how seriously the symptoms were taken was very real. Antidepressants like Effexor don't produce the same kind of drug-seeking behavior or escalating tolerance typically associated with classic addiction. Patients weren't chasing a high. They weren't increasing their own doses without medical guidance to chase a diminishing effect. In that narrow technical sense, discontinuation syndrome was a defensible term, distinguishing the physiological adaptation happening in the brain from the behavioral and psychological patterns of substance addiction. The problem was never really the technical accuracy of the term. The problem was how the softer language shaped clinical urgency, insurance coverage decisions, and even how patients themselves interpreted their own symptoms. If your literature describes something as a syndrome that resolves within 1 to 2 weeks, mild in most cases, and you find yourself 3 months in, still experiencing brain zaps daily, still crying without explanation, still unable to sleep through a single uninterrupted night, the mismatch between what you are told to expect and what you're actually living through creates its own particular kind of psychological damage. Patients began to doubt themselves. Am I the unusual case? Is something else wrong with me? Am I just weak, unable to handle a process everyone else apparently sails through in a week or two? The gentle, sanitized language had the perverse effect of isolating exactly the patients who needed reassurance and validation the most. Over time, as more rigorous research accumulated and patient advocacy groups grew louder and more organized, the medical community began edging toward more honest terminology, acknowledging that for a meaningful subset of patients, the experience of stopping certain antidepressants, Effexor prominent among them, genuinely resembled withdrawal in duration, severity, and physiological mechanism, whatever careful word choice the official guidelines preferred. This shift didn't happen overnight, and traces of the old, gentler framing still linger in some prescribing information today. But the gap between the polite clinical euphemism and the lived patient experience had, by this point become simply too well documented, too widely reported, and too consistent across too many independent patient accounts to paper over with vocabulary alone. Sometimes the most important medical progress isn't a new drug or a new procedure. Sometimes it's just finally calling something by its honest name. Doctors eventually caught on that stopping Effexor abruptly was a bad idea. So tapering schedules emerged, gradual dose reductions meant to ease the brain back to baseline. The trouble was that even these tapers, often designed for other, gentler antidepressants, moved far too quickly for what this particular drug demanded. Patients following textbook tapers still ended up in withdrawal, prompting a slow and painful realization across the psychiatric community that Effexor simply did not play by the same timeline as everything else on the shelf. Standard tapering advice for years followed a fairly generic template, borrowed largely from experience with other antidepressant classes. Reduce the dose by a set percentage every 1 to 2 weeks, monitor for symptoms, adjust if necessary. This approach worked reasonably well for many SSRIs, where the drug's longer half-life provided a naturally gentler decline even during a relatively brisk taper. Applied to Effexor, with its dramatically shorter half-life, this same schedule frequently produced exactly the symptoms it was designed to prevent. Brain zaps returning within days of each dose reduction, patients caught in a repeating cycle of temporary stability followed by renewed disruption every time the dose ticked downward. Psychiatrists following these guidelines in good faith were in effect applying a map drawn for a different, gentler terrain. The instructions weren't malicious or careless. They simply hadn't yet been updated to reflect what was becoming increasingly clear through patient experience, that Effexor's pharmacokinetics demanded a fundamentally different, much more gradual approach than the general antidepressant tapering template assumed. Patients following these standard tapers precisely as instructed, doing everything right by the book, still found themselves blindsided by symptoms partway through, which created its own layer of confusion and self-doubt. If I'm following the doctor's exact instructions and still feeling this way, something must be unusually wrong with me specifically, rather than the more accurate conclusion, which was that the instructions themselves hadn't caught up to the reality of the drug. Some patients, frustrated by repeated failed attempts using standard tapers, began extending the process on their own initiative, spacing out dose reductions over many more weeks than officially recommended, sometimes without full physician awareness or support, simply because the officially sanctioned pace kept failing them in practice. This informal, patient-driven experimentation, uncomfortable as it was to navigate without proper medical guidance, provided some of the earliest practical evidence that a slower, more patient approach could meaningfully reduce symptom severity, evidence that would eventually filter back into more formal clinical recommendations, though this process took considerably longer than anyone experiencing brain zaps in the meantime would have preferred. By the time tapering guidelines specific to Effexor's particular pharmacokinetic profile became more widely available and more consistently followed, an entire generation of patients had already gone through the standard, poorly suited tapering process, many of them assuming their difficulty was a personal failing rather than a predictable consequence of a schedule built for a different drug entirely. It's a quiet but telling detail in the larger Effexor story that patients were, once again, ahead of the official guidance, forced to discover through trial, error, and shared frustration exactly how slowly this particular chemical needed to be released from its grip. Faced with tapering schedules that weren't working, some patients and sympathetic pharmacists began improvising, converting pills into liquid suspensions so doses could be reduced by increments too small for any pill cutter to manage, sometimes by mere fractions of a milligram over many months. This wasn't officially sanctioned by the drug's original guidelines. It was patients and prescribers essentially reverse engineering a slower exit because the standard one kept leaving people stranded halfway down the ladder. The math behind this improvisation is fairly straightforward once you understand the underlying problem. Effexor capsules typically contain small beads of medication designed for extended release, beads that can, with some care, be counted and removed individually to create smaller and smaller doses, a technique that became almost folkloric among patients desperate enough to try it. Compounding pharmacies, meanwhile, began offering custom liquid formulations that allowed for even finer dose adjustments than counting individual beads ever could, opening the door to reductions measured in fractions of a single milligram rather than the comparatively enormous jumps built into standard pill strengths. This grassroots innovation mattered enormously for patients whose brains simply couldn't tolerate the standard step-down sizes, no matter how slowly those steps were spaced out in time. Sometimes the problem wasn't the pace of the calendar, it was the size of each individual drop, a decrease that felt to an already sensitized nervous system less like a gentle step and more like being pushed off a ledge, however small the ledge appeared on paper. Liquid titration solved this by shrinking the ledge itself, allowing patients to descend a staircase built from dozens of tiny, almost imperceptible steps, rather than the handful of large, jarring ones the pharmaceutical packaging had ever anticipated. None of this arrived from an official manufacturer protocol. It emerged from patient forums, compounding pharmacists willing to experiment thoughtfully within reasonable safety bounds, and a slowly growing network of psychiatrists paying closer attention to what their own patients were reporting, rather than relying solely on the standard prescribing literature. In many respects, this represents one of the more remarkable, if quietly frustrating, chapters in the entire Effexor story. Ordinary patients and small pockets of the medical community essentially building better clinical practice from the ground up, years before that practice earned any kind of official institutional endorsement. The approach wasn't without its own complications. Compounded liquid formulations required careful, consistent handling to ensure dosing accuracy, and not every patient had access to a compounding pharmacy willing or equipped to provide this kind of specialized service, creating a quiet inequality where the smoothest possible exit from Effexor was available primarily to patients with the resources, persistence, and geographic luck to find the right pharmacy and the right supportive physician. Still, for those who found their way to this underground titration approach, it often represented the difference between a withdrawal process measured in unbearable weeks and one measured in merely difficult months. A meaningful distinction for anyone who has ever tried to function at a job, raise children, or simply get through an ordinary Tuesday while their own brain intermittently short-circuits without warning. For pregnant patients already taking Effexor, the calculation became particularly cruel. Stopping abruptly risked withdrawal for both mother and, in some cases, newborn. Continuing carried its own set of considerations doctors were still working out in real time. Women found themselves weighing risks with imperfect information, often making the decision that felt survivable in the moment rather than the one with a tidy answer, because tidy answers were in short supply. Depression and anxiety during pregnancy are, in their own right, serious medical concerns, not conditions to be dismissed lightly or treated as something an expectant mother should simply push through unmedicated for the sake of caution. Untreated maternal depression carries its own documented risks to the mother's well-being and, in some studies, to pregnancy outcomes and infant development as well. This meant the decision facing a pregnant patient on Effexor was never a simple choice between a risky medication and a risk-free alternative. It was a genuine balancing act between two imperfect paths, each carrying its own set of uncertainties that even careful specialists could only partially quantify. Some infants exposed to Effexor throughout pregnancy experienced what's sometimes called neonatal adaptation syndrome, a set of symptoms in newborns, including irritability, feeding difficulties, and disrupted sleep patterns, that researchers came to understand as the infant's own small, unwitting version of discontinuation, having been exposed to the medication throughout gestation and then abruptly separated from that supply the moment the umbilical cord was cut. Watching a newborn experience even a mild version of a symptom pattern, parents themselves might recognize from their own withdrawal attempts, added a particularly heavy emotional weight to an already difficult situation. Guilt layered on top of an already exhausting, hormonally turbulent period that new parenthood brings under the best of circumstances. Breastfeeding introduced its own separate set of considerations, since small amounts of the medication do pass into breast milk, requiring careful individual conversations between mother and physician about relative risks and benefits that varied considerably depending on the specific clinical picture. Some mothers chose to continue the medication throughout breastfeeding, judging the documented benefits of breastfeeding and maternal mental stability to outweigh the relatively low levels of medication exposure involved. Others chose differently, and reasonable, well-informed physicians could be found supporting either path depending on the particulars of the individual patient sitting in front of them. What made this entire chapter of the Effexor story particularly difficult wasn't necessarily the absence of any research, though the research base for pregnancy and lactation specifically remained frustratingly thinner than anyone would prefer for a medication this widely prescribed among women of childbearing age. It was the emotional weight of making an irreversible decision whether to continue medication, taper during pregnancy, or stop altogether, under conditions of genuine, unavoidable uncertainty, often while already managing the physical and emotional demands of pregnancy itself. There was no clean answer waiting at the end of enough research, only a series of individualized risk calculations that shifted depending on the severity of the underlying condition, the specific trimester, family history, and support systems available. For many women navigating this particular chapter, the deepest frustration wasn't the difficulty of the decision itself, but the sense that they were being asked to make a profoundly consequential choice with considerably less clear guidance than the situation seemed to deserve. Long before withdrawal was taken seriously by mainstream medicine, patients found each other online, in forums with names that sounded almost cheerful, trading tips on liquid titration, comparing brain zap intensity like weather reports, talking each other through 3 a.m. panic. These forums became, in effect, an entire shadow medical literature written by patients because the official literature hadn't caught up yet. Some of the most accurate withdrawal timelines available for years existed only in these threads. Picture the format itself: a modest web forum, unglamorous design, a handful of dedicated moderators who were themselves patients rather than medical professionals, and thread titles that read like small, weary distress signals sent out into the dark. Anyone else getting zaps this bad on day 4? Liquid taper schedule that finally worked for me. Please tell me this gets better. Beneath these unassuming headlines sat years of accumulated, carefully documented patient experience, timelines tracking symptom onset and resolution, with a rigour that occasionally exceeded what appeared in the sparse formal literature available at the time. What made these communities genuinely valuable wasn't just emotional support, though the emotional support mattered enormously for people going through an experience their own doctors sometimes struggled to fully validate. It was the sheer accumulated pattern recognition. When enough people independently report the same symptom sequence, the same rough timeline, the same specific triggers, that convergence starts to function as genuine data, even without a formal study design or peer review behind it. researchers eventually began paying attention to these communities directly, recognizing that patients had, out of sheer necessity, assembled a more granular and more honest picture of the discontinuation experience than existing clinical trials had managed to capture. The tone of these forums shifted over the years as awareness grew more broadly. Early threads carried a certain bewildered, almost apologetic quality. Patients describing symptoms with a kind of tentative uncertainty, half expecting to be told they were overreacting or misattributing unrelated problems to the medication. Later threads, as the community's collective knowledge deepened, and more members arrived already aware that brain zaps and prolonged withdrawal were real, documented phenomena, carried a different energy entirely, practical, specific, generous with detailed advice about titration schedules and coping strategies for the worst days. The forums had, in a real sense, professionalized their own informal expertise over time, becoming something closer to peer-led clinical guidance than simple emotional venting, however unofficial that guidance remained in the eyes of formal medicine. It's worth sitting with the strange, slightly uncomfortable truth embedded in this chapter of the story. For a meaningful stretch of years, patients seeking the most accurate, detailed, and genuinely useful information about how to safely stop taking a widely prescribed medication were better served by an unpaid, informally moderated web forum than by the official prescribing literature their own doctors were working from. This isn't a condemnation of any individual physician, most of whom were doing their best with the information available to them at the time. It's simply a reminder that medical knowledge doesn't always flow neatly downward from research institutions to patients. Sometimes, when the institutions are slow to catch up, it flows the other way entirely, built quietly, thread by thread, by the very people living through the problem everyone else was still failing to fully name. Imagine describing brain zaps, vertigo, and crying spells to a doctor who nods politely and suggests you're simply relapsing into your original depression. This happened constantly. Withdrawal symptoms mimicked the very conditions Effexor was meant to treat: anxiety, low mood, sleeplessness, which meant patients were frequently told the medication was still needed rather than being told they were withdrawing from it. Some were put right back on the drug, not because they needed it, but because nobody recognized what was actually happening. This diagnostic overlap created what amounts to a nearly perfect trap, one that wasn't the result of any individual doctor's carelessness, so much as a structural blind spot built into how psychiatric symptoms get interpreted in the first place. If a patient stops a medication for depression, and within days begins experiencing low mood, anxiety, and disrupted sleep, the most obvious clinical interpretation, the one taught in every psychiatric training program, is that the underlying condition has returned. This interpretation isn't unreasonable on its face. It's simply, in a significant number of Effexor cases, the wrong one, and distinguishing between genuine relapse and withdrawal, masquerading as relapse, required a level of nuanced pattern recognition that many physicians, through no particular fault of their own, hadn't yet been trained to apply. The distinguishing details, when doctors did learn to look for them, tended to involve timing and texture rather than simple symptom checklists. Withdrawal symptoms typically emerged within days of a dose reduction, often accompanied by physical sensations, brain zaps, dizziness, flu-like malaise that don't typically appear alongside a straightforward depressive relapse. Genuine relapse, by contrast, tends to develop more gradually and lacks that specific physical signature. But recognizing this distinction required physicians to actively consider withdrawal as a competing diagnosis in the first place. And for years, many simply weren't trained to think that way, having absorbed a medical culture in which stopping a psychiatric medication and feeling worse was assumed to mean the medication had been necessary all along. A tidy, self-confirming loop that left very little room for an alternative explanation. The consequences of this misdiagnosis pattern were genuinely significant for the patients caught inside it. Being told your withdrawal symptoms are actually a relapse, and being placed back on the very medication you were trying to leave doesn't just delay the eventual discontinuation process. It can also quietly erode a patient's trust in their own perception of their body, a particularly damaging outcome for anyone already managing a mental health condition where self-trust and self-advocacy matter enormously for long-term recovery. Patients described feeling gaslit, a word that gets used loosely in many contexts but applies with unusual precision here, told repeatedly that what they were clearly physically experiencing was actually something else entirely, something happening only in their mind rather than in their nervous system. Over time, as awareness spread, both through accumulating research and through the kind of grassroots patient advocacy discussed elsewhere in this story, physicians grew more adept at distinguishing withdrawal from relapse, asking more targeted questions about symptom timing and physical sensation, rather than defaulting immediately to the relapse explanation. This shift, while genuinely encouraging, arrived too late for the many patients who spent months or years cycling unnecessarily back onto a medication they'd been actively trying to leave, victims not of any deliberate negligence but of a diagnostic blind spot that took the medical establishment considerably longer to correct than it took the patients themselves to figure out, through hard, repeated, frustrating experience, that something else entirely was going on. Eventually, some patients pursued legal action, arguing the manufacturer hadn't adequately warned about withdrawal severity. These cases rarely succeeded in dramatic fashion, hampered by the same challenge that dogs most pharmaceutical litigation, proving a specific harm was both foreseeable and inadequately disclosed. Warning labels were updated over the years, but updated labels don't retroactively comfort someone who already spent 6 months feeling like their skull was wired to a faulty extension cord. Pharmaceutical litigation of this kind faces a particular set of legal hurdles that make it considerably harder to win than the general public often assumes. A plaintiff generally needs to demonstrate not just that harm occurred, but that the manufacturer knew, or reasonably should have known, about the specific risk at the time the product was marketed, and that adequate warning would have meaningfully changed the outcome, whether by altering a physician's prescribing decision or a patient's willingness to take the medication in the first place. Proving this chain of causation retroactively years after the fact, using evidence that itself accumulated gradually and unevenly over time, presents a genuinely difficult legal challenge, regardless of how sympathetic the underlying patient experience might be to a jury. Several cases did proceed through various stages of litigation over the years, some settling quietly, others dismissed for failing to clear the specific legal thresholds required. The details of these individual cases matter less for our purposes than the broader pattern they reveal, a legal system genuinely ill-suited to addressing harms that emerge gradually, unevenly, and initially through patient anecdote, rather than through a single dramatic, clearly documented incident. Contrast this with, say, a defective medical device causing an immediate and obvious injury. Discontinuation symptoms accumulating slowly across a population of patients, initially dismissed by many physicians as relapse or anxiety, simply don't generate the kind of clean, individually attributable harm that legal systems are generally built to address efficiently. What these lawsuits did accomplish, even in cases that didn't result in a significant financial judgment, was contribute to the broader public record, generating discovery documents, expert testimony, and formal legal attention that helped validate what patients had been reporting informally for years. In this sense, litigation served a function somewhat separate from its stated legal purpose, adding institutional weight and formal documentation to a pattern that had, until that point, existed primarily in patient forums and anecdotal physician reports. Lawyers, in their own separate lane from doctors and researchers, were contributing to the same slow process of institutional validation happening across multiple fronts simultaneously. Warning labels for Effexor and similar medications were indeed strengthened over the years that followed, incorporating more explicit language about discontinuation symptoms and recommending more gradual tapering approaches than the original guidance had suggested. This represents genuine progress, and future patients starting the medication benefit from considerably more honest expectations than patients did in the 90s. But updated language on a label, however well-intentioned and however hard-won through years of accumulated pressure from patients, researchers, and litigation alike, offers little practical comfort to the patients who already lived through the earlier, less informed era, discovering the hard way, dose by missed dose, exactly what the fine print should have told them from the very beginning. Effexor wasn't the only SNRI to eventually develop, and comparing it to relatives like Cymbalta or Pristic is a bit like comparing siblings who all inherited the family temper, but in different doses. Pristic in particular is essentially Effexor's own metabolite, marketed separately, sometimes prescribed specifically to ease patients off the original. All of them share some capacity for withdrawal difficulty, but Effexor has consistently topped patient-reported severity rankings, earning its reputation the hard way. Cymbalta, chemically known as duloxetine, arrived on the market roughly a decade after Effexor and shares the same fundamental dual-action approach to serotonin and norepinephrine. It also carries its own documented withdrawal profile, sometimes described by patients using strikingly similar language: brain zaps, dizziness, a general sense of internal static. Duloxetine's half-life runs somewhat longer than venlafaxine's, which in theory should provide a slightly gentler natural taper, even during abrupt discontinuation, though in practice many patients report symptoms severe enough to make this theoretical advantage feel largely academic when actually living through it. Pristic chemically does venlafaxine, occupies a particularly interesting spot in this family lineage, since it's essentially the active metabolite that Effexor itself converts into once processed by the liver. Marketing this compound as its own separate medication allowed for some additional dosing precision and, notably, became a tool some psychiatrists use specifically to help patients transition off Effexor, essentially substituting a closely related molecule with slightly different pharmacokinetics as an intermediate step in a longer, more gradual exit strategy. This approach, sometimes called bridging, worked reasonably well for some patients, offering a smoother off-ramp than jumping directly from Effexor to nothing. What separates Effexor from these chemical relatives most consistently across patient-reported data isn't necessarily the underlying mechanism, which all three share in broad strokes, but that stubborn, short half-life discussed earlier, the one that makes Effexor's discontinuation curve so much steeper than its cousins. Cymbalta and Pristic both clear from the body somewhat more gradually, providing patients with a bit more natural buffer, even without any deliberate tapering effort. This difference shows up reliably across patient surveys and clinical observation alike, with Effexor consistently rated as producing more severe and more immediate discontinuation symptoms compared to its later chemical siblings, a reputation that, fair or not, has followed the original compound for decades. None of this is to suggest Cymbalta or Pristic represents some kind of withdrawal-free alternative, because they emphatically do not, and patients on either medication can and do experience genuinely difficult discontinuation processes of their own. But the comparison matters for understanding how an entire drug class learned, gradually and sometimes painfully, from the specific mistakes and specific chemistry of its earliest member. Effexor arrived first, encountered the withdrawal problem with the least institutional preparation, and in doing so became something like the cautionary older sibling whose difficult adolescence taught the rest of the family what warning signs to watch for. Later medications benefited from earlier prescribing guidance, more explicit tapering protocols built into their original marketing rather than added years later as a correction, and a physician community already primed to take discontinuation seriously from the outset. It's a strange kind of legacy for a medication to leave behind, not just its own patient outcomes, but a permanently improved cautionary framework for every chemical relative that followed. Occasionally, public figures have spoken about their own experiences discontinuing antidepressants, offering brief glimpses into a struggle usually kept private. These moments rarely name Effexor specifically, but they've helped normalize a conversation psychiatry avoided for years, that stopping a medication can be its own medical event, deserving of the same seriousness as starting one. Public figures occupy a strange, dual position when it comes to disclosing struggles with medication, simultaneously more scrutinized and more capable of shifting broad public perception than almost anyone else discussing the same experience. A single interview, a single candid social media post, describing symptoms of medication discontinuation can reach and validate more people in a single afternoon than years of patient forum posts ever could, simply by virtue of audience size and cultural visibility. This isn't necessarily fair to the thousands of ordinary patients who did the harder, less glamorous work of documenting their own experiences for years without any of that reach. But cultural change tends to arrive unevenly, often accelerated disproportionately by whoever happens to have the largest microphone available at the right moment. These public admissions, when they happened, tended to follow a fairly consistent pattern: initial reluctance, a sense of stigma around admitting to psychiatric medication use in the first place, followed eventually by a more detailed and often surprisingly raw description of what discontinuation actually felt like, once the person decided the value of honesty outweighed the discomfort of public vulnerability. Audiences responded to these moments with a particular kind of relief, a sense that if someone with resources, access to excellent medical care, and every reason to present a polished public image was still struggling this visibly with the same brain zaps and emotional turbulence ordinary patients had been describing in forums for years, then the problem clearly wasn't a matter of individual weakness or inadequate willpower. The broader cultural shift toward destigmatizing mental health treatment generally, which accelerated noticeably over the past 2 decades, created fertile ground for these more specific conversations about discontinuation to land meaningfully, rather than disappearing immediately into background noise. A decade earlier, the same candid admission might have generated more tabloid speculation than genuine informational value. By the time these conversations became more common, cultural readiness had shifted enough that the information itself, rather than the mere fact of disclosure, became the primary takeaway for most audiences encountering it. It's worth noting that this particular thread in the larger Effexor story operates somewhat differently from the others, relying less on documented data and more on cultural momentum, harder to pin down with precision but genuinely influential nonetheless. Psychiatry as an institution moves slowly, shaped by peer-reviewed research and gradual guideline revisions. Public perception, shaped partly by exactly these kinds of candid celebrity admissions, sometimes moves considerably faster, softening the ground for the more formal institutional changes to eventually take root. Neither force alone fully explains how Effexor's reputation evolved from a well-marketed miracle drug in the 90s to a widely acknowledged cautionary tale by the following decades. But the visible, if imprecise, contribution of public figures willing to describe their own uncomfortable experiences certainly played its own quiet part in that broader, gradual reckoning. Insomnia during withdrawal has a particular flavour, a wired exhaustion where your body is desperate for sleep and your nervous system refuses to cooperate. Patients describe lying in the dark at 2 a.m, heart pounding for no discernible reason, brain zapping intermittently like a dying light bulb, wondering if this is simply what the rest of their life will feel like now. It is not. But convincing an exhausted brain of that fact at 2 a.m. is its own particular challenge. This particular symptom deserves its own careful attention because it operates on a kind of vicious feedback loop that other withdrawal symptoms don't quite replicate. Sleep deprivation, on its own, worsens nearly every other symptom on the withdrawal list: mood, anxiety, cognitive clarity, even the frequency and intensity of brain zaps themselves. So when withdrawal disrupts sleep, it isn't simply adding one more unpleasant item to an already long list. It's actively amplifying every other item on that list simultaneously, a multiplier effect that made this particular symptom feel, to many patients, like the true centre of gravity around which the entire withdrawal experience orbited. The mechanism behind this sleep disruption connects directly back to the norepinephrine side of Effexor's dual action. Norepinephrine plays a significant role in the body's alertness and arousal systems, the same systems responsible for the fight-or-flight response. A brain that has spent months or years adjusting its baseline norepinephrine sensitivity around a steady external supply doesn't simply relax back into normal sleep patterns the moment that supply disappears. Instead, many patients describe a kind of wired, jittery exhaustion, a body that feels bone-tired while the nervous system remains stubbornly, uncomfortably alert, as though someone left the porch light on in a house where everyone desperately wants to go to sleep. Patients developed a range of coping strategies during this period, some more effective than others, ranging from strict sleep hygiene routines to over-the-counter aids to simply accepting, with as much grace as they could muster, that certain nights would be lost entirely to restless wakefulness. What helped most patients, according to the accumulated forum wisdom discussed earlier, wasn't any single miracle intervention, but rather patience combined with the reassurance that this particular symptom, however miserable, followed a fairly predictable arc, typically improving gradually over the weeks, following a dose reduction, rather than persisting indefinitely at its worst intensity. That reassurance, though, is considerably easier to hold on to in daylight than at 2 a.m, staring at a ceiling, heart inexplicably racing, brain occasionally delivering an unwelcome electrical jolt just to remind you it's still recalibrating. The isolation of this particular hour matters enormously to the experience. Nighttime withdrawal symptoms happen without the distraction of work, conversation, or daylight activity to occupy the mind elsewhere. There is only the dark room, the racing heart, and the deeply unhelpful mental math of calculating how many hours remain before an alarm clock demands functional wakefulness, regardless of how the night actually went. Patients who made it through this particular chapter successfully often describe a specific turning point, not a single dramatic night of relief, but a slow, almost imperceptible shift where the 2 a.m. wakings became less frequent, less intense, and eventually, blessedly, rare enough to stop dreading each night as its own small ordeal. Nearly everyone who has ever taken Effexor has, at some point, run out of pills over a long weekend or a delayed refill and thought, how bad can this really be? The answer arrives within 12 to 24 hours, and it is considerably worse than anticipated. Cold turkey discontinuation remains one of the most common ways people first discover exactly what this drug is capable of when denied its daily appointment. There's a particular universal quality to this experience that transcends nearly every other detail of an individual patient's story. Doesn't matter how long someone had been taking the medication, whether 6 months or 6 years. Doesn't matter their age, their underlying condition, or how carefully they'd otherwise manage their health. The scenario repeats itself with remarkable consistency: a mundane logistical hiccup, a delayed pharmacy refill, a vacation packing oversight, a busy week where the prescription simply slips through the cracks, followed by a rapid and unwelcome education in exactly why this particular medication doesn't tolerate even brief interruptions gracefully. The onset timeline for cold turkey discontinuation tends to be remarkably fast, given Effexor's short half-life, often beginning within 12 hours and reaching noticeable intensity by the 24-hour mark, a speed that catches most patients completely off guard the first time it happens. Compare this to the mental model most people carry around regarding medication and missed doses generally, an assumption, reasonable for most drugs, that skipping a single day here or there carries minimal consequence. Effexor shatters this assumption almost immediately, delivering brain zaps, dizziness, nausea, and a wave of anxiety disproportionate to the actual missed time frame, often within the same day the dose was due. What makes this particular experience so universally memorable, aside from its sheer unpleasantness, is the confusion that typically accompanies it the first time around. Patients rarely connect their sudden onset of symptoms immediately to the missed dose, especially if the timing doesn't feel obviously connected. A missed pill from the previous evening producing strange symptoms the following afternoon. Many patients describe genuine alarm during their first cold turkey experience, wondering if something entirely unrelated and more serious might be happening: a stroke, a seizure, some undiagnosed neurological condition, before eventually connecting the dots back to the missing pill sitting untaken in its bottle. This pattern repeats often enough across enough patients that it's become something like a shared rite of passage within the Effexor patient community, a story nearly everyone has some version of, usually told now with a kind of grim, retrospective humour once enough time has passed to soften the original fear. The vacation where the suitcase got left behind, the pharmacy that ran out of stock for 3 excruciating days, the busy week where the refill reminder got lost among a dozen other notifications. Each story ends roughly the same way, with the patient vowing fervently and permanently to never again let their supply run anywhere close to empty. A promise most of them, having learned this particular lesson exactly once, keep with considerably more discipline than they'd ever managed to apply to any other prescription in their life. Beyond the physical zaps and dizziness lies a subtler withdrawal phenomenon, an emotional flooding where feelings long suppressed by the medication return all at once, sometimes years of quietly numbed grief or anger surfacing within weeks. Patients describe crying at commercials, feeling rage over minor inconveniences, or experiencing joy so intense it feels disorienting. The drug had been doing quiet editorial work on your emotional range for years, and its absence is not neutral. This particular aspect of withdrawal rarely gets the same attention as the more dramatic physical symptoms, brain zaps especially. But patients who've lived through both often describe the emotional flooding as, in its own way, the more genuinely disorienting experience of the two. A brain zap is unpleasant but discreet, a brief, identifiable event with a clear beginning and end. Emotional flooding is more like discovering that the emotional thermostat you'd grown accustomed to for years has suddenly been removed entirely, leaving every feeling arriving at full, unfiltered intensity, with none of the gentle dampening the medication had quietly been providing all along, without you ever fully realizing it was there. Antidepressants, including Effexor, don't simply eliminate negative emotions the way pain medication numbs physical discomfort. What they more often do, according to patient accounts across countless different medications, is create a kind of emotional buffer, taking the sharpest edges off both the lowest lows and, for many patients, the highest highs as well. This trade-off is often worthwhile and even necessary for someone in genuine crisis. But it means that years spent on the medication can also mean years spent slightly emotionally muted in ways the patient themselves may not have consciously registered, having simply adjusted to this new baseline as though it were their natural emotional range all along. When the medication leaves, that buffer leaves with it, sometimes gradually and sometimes with startling speed, and the emotions that return aren't necessarily new. They're often old, accumulated over the entire period of medication use, arriving now with an intensity that feels overwhelming precisely because it's been so long since the patient last felt anything at quite this volume. Grief over a loss that happened years earlier might resurface with surprising sharpness. Minor frustrations that would once have rolled off easily now provoke disproportionate irritation. Even positive experiences can feel strangely intense, a kind of emotional recalibration that, while ultimately often healthy and necessary, feels deeply unsettling while it's actually happening. Patients frequently describe feeling frightened by this phase specifically because it doesn't feel like withdrawal in the way brain zaps obviously do. It feels, instead, like something has fundamentally changed about their personality or emotional stability. A frightening thought for anyone already managing an underlying mental health condition and worried about relapse. Reassurance from a knowledgeable physician or from other patients who've navigated this same phase successfully tends to matter enormously here, helping distinguish this temporary emotional recalibration from a genuine deterioration in mental health. Most patients who push through this particular stretch describe eventually reaching a kind of emotional equilibrium that feels, in a strange way, more authentically theirs than the muted baseline the medication had provided, even if getting there required weathering several genuinely uncomfortable weeks of feeling everything just a little too loudly for comfort. For a subset of patients, withdrawal doesn't resolve in the expected weeks or months. It lingers, sometimes for a year or more, a condition now cautiously discussed as protracted withdrawal. Medicine still doesn't fully understand why some brains recover quickly, while others take this much longer path back to equilibrium, and patients living through it often describe a peculiar loneliness, existing in a medical grey zone with no clean diagnosis and no clean timeline. Most withdrawal literature, even the more honest and updated versions that eventually emerged, tends to describe a symptom timeline measured in weeks, occasionally stretching into a couple of months for particularly sensitive individuals. This framework, while accurate for the majority of patients, leaves out an important minority for whom this timeline simply doesn't apply. Patients whose symptoms persist stubbornly well beyond any reasonable expected resolution point, sometimes for many months, occasionally for a year or longer, defying both the official guidance and their own doctor's reassurances that things should be improving by now. The exact mechanism behind protracted withdrawal remains genuinely unclear, an honest gap in current medical understanding rather than a settled explanation. Researchers have simply failed to communicate well. Some theories point toward individual variation in receptor recovery rates, suggesting that certain brains simply require more time to fully readjust their sensitivity after prolonged medication exposure. Others point toward the total duration of prior medication use, the specific dose history, or even genetic factors influencing how quickly the relevant neurotransmitter systems reset. None of these theories has yet developed into a reliable predictive model, capable of telling a given patient in advance whether they're likely to fall into this more difficult category, which leaves patients experiencing protracted symptoms in a particularly frustrating position, unable even to access a clear explanation for why their experience diverges so significantly from what most literature and most physicians expect. This gap between expectation and lived experience creates a specific and painful kind of isolation. Friends, family, and sometimes even treating physicians, all operating from the assumption that withdrawal should be resolving by now, based on the more common timeline, may begin to doubt whether the ongoing symptoms are genuinely connected to the medication at all, wondering aloud whether something else might be going on, or whether the patient might simply be experiencing a separate, unrelated anxiety condition. Patients themselves often describe a similar internal doubt, questioning their own experience against a backdrop of official guidance that insists this shouldn't still be happening, several months past the point where recovery was supposed to have occurred. What ultimately helps most patients navigating protracted withdrawal, according to the accounts that do exist, isn't a specific medical intervention, since none has proven reliably effective across this population, but rather validation, connection with other patients who've experienced similarly extended timelines, and physicians willing to acknowledge honestly that medicine's current understanding here remains genuinely incomplete, rather than offering false reassurance simply to end an uncomfortable conversation. Protracted withdrawal remains one of the more humbling chapters in the entire Effexor story, a reminder that even with decades of accumulated patient data and improved clinical guidelines, certain individual experiences still fall outside what current science can fully explain or reliably predict, leaving both patients and physicians to navigate genuine uncertainty together, one uncomfortable month at a time. Over the past decade, psychiatric guidelines have shifted meaningfully, acknowledging withdrawal as a legitimate and sometimes severe clinical concern rather than a footnote. Slower tapering protocols, hyperbolic tapering in particular, have gained traction, informed largely by patient advocacy and the accumulated weight of forum data that clinicians once dismissed. It has been, in its own way, a rare instance of grassroots patient knowledge dragging institutional medicine toward a more honest position. This shift didn't arrive through any single dramatic breakthrough study or any one influential paper that changed minds overnight. It accumulated gradually, through a combination of forces working in loose, uncoordinated parallel, growing academic interest from researchers willing to take patient-reported outcomes seriously as legitimate data rather than dismissing them as anecdote, increasing pressure from patient advocacy groups who had, by this point, spent years compiling detailed and consistent accounts of their own experiences, and a slowly shifting culture within psychiatric training itself, one gradually more willing to treat medication discontinuation as a distinct clinical skill deserving its own dedicated attention, rather than an afterthought tacked onto the initial prescribing conversation. Professional psychiatric organizations began revising their formal guidance documents to reflect this more nuanced understanding, incorporating specific recommendations for SNRI tapering that acknowledged the particular challenges posed by short half-life medications like Effexor. These revisions represented genuine institutional progress, moving discontinuation planning from an improvised afterthought to a formally recognized component of responsible prescribing practice. Medical schools and residency programs gradually incorporated more detailed instruction on recognizing and managing withdrawal symptoms, correcting, at least for newer generations of physicians, the training gap that had left earlier doctors so ill-equipped to recognize what their patients were actually experiencing. The specific technique that gained the most traction during this period, hyperbolic tapering, deserves particular attention because it represents a genuinely thoughtful, evidence-informed response to the specific pharmacological challenge Effexor presents. Rather than reducing doses by fixed percentages at fixed intervals, hyperbolic tapering adjusts the size of each reduction based on the actual receptor occupancy curve of the medication, which for many psychiatric drugs follows a pattern where the same dose reduction produces increasingly larger effects on receptor activity as the overall dose gets smaller. This means the final stretches of a taper, dropping from a very small dose to nothing at all, often need to proceed far more slowly and in far smaller increments than the earlier stages, a counterintuitive insight that took considerable research and patient-reported data to properly document and formalize into practical clinical guidance. What makes this chapter of the story genuinely notable isn't simply that medicine eventually got things right, though that matters enormously for current and future patients who now benefit from considerably better guidance than existed even a decade earlier. It's the specific mechanism by which that correction happened, patient experience, initially dismissed or minimized, eventually accumulating enough weight and enough consistency across enough independent sources that it became impossible for the institution to continue ignoring it. This pattern, patients as the earliest and most reliable source of certain kinds of medical knowledge, long before formal research catches up, isn't unique to Effexor, but few medications illustrate it quite so clearly or quite so painfully as this one does. A drug whose most important safety lessons were taught not by its own manufacturer, but by the very people who lived through learning them the hard way. For some, the trade-off calculation simply resolves in the medication's favour, permanently. The depression or anxiety Effexor treats is severe enough, and the withdrawal risk daunting enough, that patients and doctors together decide staying on the drug indefinitely is the more survivable path. This isn't failure. It's an honest reckoning with a medication that works well for the condition it treats, and poorly for the moment you try to leave it. This particular outcome deserves careful, compassionate attention, because it's easy, especially after spending so much time cataloguing the difficulties of withdrawal, to slip into a framing where staying on the medication indefinitely sounds like a defeat, a failure to achieve the presumably preferable goal of eventually living medication-free. This framing does a genuine disservice to the many patients for whom continuing Effexor long-term represents not a failure at all, but a carefully considered, entirely reasonable medical decision, weighing the documented severity of their underlying condition against the documented difficulty of the withdrawal process, and concluding, with their physician support, that the balance tips clearly toward continued treatment. Depression and anxiety, for a meaningful population of patients, aren't temporary conditions that resolve after a defined treatment course, the way a course of antibiotics resolves an infection. For some patients, these conditions function more like a chronic illness, requiring ongoing management indefinitely, not unlike how a patient with a chronic autoimmune condition might remain on a particular medication for their entire life without anyone framing that as a failure to eventually recover. Applying this same, more compassionate framework to Effexor specifically simply acknowledges that for some patients, the medication that finally worked, after years of trying other options that didn't, deserves to be respected as a long-term solution rather than treated as a temporary bridge that must eventually be crossed and left behind. The withdrawal difficulty specific to Effexor does factor meaningfully into this calculation for many patients, in a way that's worth being honest about rather than glossing over with purely reassuring language, knowing that stopping the medication carries a real risk of months of brain zaps, disrupted sleep, and emotional turbulence understandably makes some patients, entirely reasonably, less inclined to attempt discontinuation unless there's a specific compelling reason to do so. A planned pregnancy, a significant change in symptom severity, or simply a personal desire to periodically reassess whether the medication remains necessary. Absent one of these specific motivating factors, many patients and physicians alike conclude that the risk and discomfort of attempting withdrawal simply isn't justified by an uncertain potential benefit, particularly for patients doing genuinely well on their current treatment. This outcome represents, in its own quiet way, one of the more honest and mature conclusions available within the entire Effexor story. Not every medication needs an exit plan. Not every patient needs to eventually prove they can function without pharmaceutical support. For the patients who've found genuine sustained stability on this particular medication, despite its well-documented reputation for difficult withdrawal, continuing treatment indefinitely isn't a compromise or a consolation prize. It's simply the right decision for their specific circumstances, made with full and clear-eyed awareness of exactly what the alternative would likely involve. The newest approach to leaving Effexor behind involves reducing the dose by smaller and smaller percentages as you go, rather than even fixed increments, a method borrowed from the mathematics of how the drug actually occupies receptors in the brain. This can stretch a taper out over a year or longer for some patients, a glacial pace that feels almost absurd until you remember. The alternative is brain zaps at 2 a.m. for 6 months straight. To understand why this approach works better than older, fixed percentage tapers, it helps to think about the relationship between dose and effect, not as a straight line but as a curve, one that grows steeper as the dose decreases. At higher doses, a fairly substantial reduction, say from 150 milligrams to 100 milligrams, might produce a relatively modest change in how many relevant receptors are actually occupied by the medication at any given moment. Because at these higher doses, receptors are already fairly saturated, and a moderate reduction doesn't shift that saturation dramatically. But at lower doses, the same size reduction, say from 10 milligrams down to 5, represents a much larger proportional change in receptor occupancy, precisely the range where patients historically experienced the worst symptoms, and precisely the range where older tapering guidance had, ironically, often recommended larger relative jumps rather than smaller ones. Hyperbolic tapering flips this pattern deliberately, calling for progressively smaller absolute dose reductions as the overall dose gets lower, so that each step down produces a roughly similar, manageable change in actual receptor occupancy, regardless of where in the taper a patient happens to be. In practical terms, this often means the final months of a taper moving from a very small dose down to 0 take up a disproportionately large share of the entire timeline, sometimes constituting nearly half the total taper duration, despite representing only a small fraction of the total dose reduction involved. This can feel, to an impatient patient eager to simply be finished, deeply counterintuitive, an agonizingly slow crawl through what looks on paper like the easy final stretch. Implementing this approach in practice generally requires the kind of liquid or compounded formulations discussed earlier, since standard pill strengths simply don't offer the granularity needed to execute a properly calculated hyperbolic curve. Some psychiatrists now work directly with compounding pharmacies to design individualized tapering schedules, sometimes stretching across 12 months or longer for patients with particularly sensitive histories or previous failed attempts using more standard, faster approaches. This represents a significant investment of time, patience, and coordination between patient, physician, and pharmacist, considerably more involved than simply writing a standard step-down prescription and checking back in a month. For patients who've successfully navigated this slower, more mathematically informed approach, the results are frequently described in almost startled terms: a taper that, for the first time, doesn't reliably trigger brain zaps and dizziness with every single dose reduction, a process that, while still genuinely long and occasionally uncomfortable, finally feels survivable rather than like a monthly ordeal to dread and brace against. It's a quietly remarkable example of how a purely theoretical insight about receptor pharmacology, once properly understood and properly applied, can translate directly into a dramatically improved lived experience for patients navigating what remains, even with this improved approach, one of the more challenging discontinuation processes in modern psychiatric medicine. Different countries have approached Effexor's regulatory life differently, some issuing stronger withdrawal warnings earlier, others lagging behind the United States in acknowledging the severity patients were reporting. Comparing these regulatory timelines reveals just how much of medicine's honesty about withdrawal was shaped by patient pressure rather than proactive caution from anyone holding a lab coat or a balance sheet. Regulatory bodies across different countries operate with varying degrees of independence, varying resource levels, and varying cultural attitudes toward pharmaceutical industry influence, which means the same underlying medication and the same underlying patient experience could produce meaningfully different official responses depending on which regulatory jurisdiction happened to be paying closest attention at any given moment. The United Kingdom's regulatory body, for instance, issued specific warnings regarding Effexor's discontinuation symptoms at certain points that arrived somewhat ahead of equivalent guidance from counterparts elsewhere, reflecting, at least in part, more assertive early attention from British psychiatric researchers who had begun documenting discontinuation patterns with particular rigour. This international variation matters for reasons beyond simple historical curiosity, because it offers something close to a natural experiment, allowing researchers and observers to compare how differently resourced and differently structured regulatory systems responded to essentially the same underlying pharmacological reality. Countries with regulatory bodies less financially entangled with pharmaceutical industry funding structures sometimes move somewhat faster in updating official guidance, though this pattern wasn't perfectly consistent across every jurisdiction, and plenty of countervailing examples exist where resource constraints or simply smaller domestic markets for the medication meant less dedicated research attention regardless of regulatory independence. Patients navigating this uneven global landscape occasionally discovered, through the same international forums discussed earlier, that the tapering advice available to them varied meaningfully, depending simply on which country's guidelines their prescribing physician happened to be following. A patient in one country might receive considerably more cautious, more gradual tapering advice than a patient with an essentially identical clinical profile in another. Not because of any meaningful difference in their underlying biology, but simply because of which regulatory body's guidance had filtered down into their particular physician's training and practice. This discrepancy, once patients became aware of it, occasionally prompted individuals to seek out and share tapering protocols from whichever country happened to have the most current, most cautious guidance available. Another small example of patients doing the work of cross-referencing institutional knowledge that ideally should have been coordinated at a higher level. The broader lesson embedded in this international comparison connects back to a theme running throughout the entire Effexor story. That institutional caution, however important and however eventually beneficial once it arrives, tends to move at a pace shaped as much by political and economic pressures as by pure scientific urgency. Countries and regulatory bodies with stronger patient advocacy infrastructure, more independent research funding, or simply a domestic media environment more willing to report critically on pharmaceutical industry practices tended, on balance, to arrive at more protective guidance somewhat sooner. This isn't a tidy or particularly satisfying conclusion, but it's an honest one, a reminder that medical safety information doesn't travel around the globe instantly or uniformly, and that where a patient happens to live can meaningfully shape how much protection and how much accurate guidance they receive when the time comes to navigate a difficult medication transition. 3 decades after approval, the picture of Effexor is considerably more complete than the one doctors had in 1993. We understand the half-life problem, the receptor mechanics behind brain zaps, the necessity of painfully slow tapers, the emotional flooding, the protracted cases. None of this knowledge arrived from the top down. Nearly all of it was assembled symptom by symptom, forum post by forum post, by the very patients the system was still learning to listen to. It's worth pausing here to take stock of just how much ground has actually been covered since that original, optimistic approval, because the contrast is genuinely striking when laid out plainly. In 1993, discontinuation wasn't meaningfully studied, wasn't meaningfully warned about, and wasn't meaningfully understood even by the researchers and clinicians closest to the medication. Today, physicians prescribing Effexor have access to detailed hyperbolic tapering protocols, an accumulated body of patient-reported outcome data spanning decades, clearer diagnostic criteria for distinguishing withdrawal from relapse, and formal acknowledgement within professional guidelines that this particular medication demands a fundamentally different, more patient exit strategy than most of its pharmaceutical peers. This transformation, comprehensive as it eventually became, arrived through a genuinely unusual pathway for medical knowledge, one worth naming clearly rather than letting slide by unremarked. Normally, we imagine medical understanding flowing in one direction. Researchers conduct studies, publish findings, and that knowledge trickles down through professional guidelines into individual physician practice, eventually reaching patients through improved care. The Effexor story largely inverted this flow for its most critical years. Patients experienced symptoms first, documented them independently through informal channels, because no formal channel existed to receive that information, built increasingly sophisticated shared knowledge about symptom patterns and coping strategies entirely outside institutional medicine, and only then did the accumulated patient wisdom filter upward into formal research attention, revised clinical guidelines, and eventually updated prescribing information. This bottom-up knowledge pathway carries an important, somewhat uncomfortable lesson for how we think about medical authority generally. Patients are not merely passive recipients of medical knowledge, waiting patiently for experts to eventually study and explain their own bodily experiences back to them. In cases like this one, where institutional attention lagged significantly behind lived reality, patients became, out of sheer necessity, the primary generators of genuinely useful clinical knowledge, years ahead of the formal research establishment that theoretically exists to produce exactly that kind of knowledge in the first place. This isn't an indictment of medical research as a discipline, which operates under legitimate constraints around rigor, funding, and institutional caution that patient forums simply don't have to navigate. It's simply an honest acknowledgement that these constraints, whatever their legitimate justification, carry a real cost, measured in years of unnecessary patient suffering before the gap eventually closed. Where does this leave things today? Considerably better than 1993, without question. Patients starting Effexor now, or working with their physician to eventually stop it, benefit from decades of hard-won knowledge that simply didn't exist for the earliest patients navigating this same chemical territory with essentially no map at all. But the story also leaves behind an important cautionary marker for whatever comes next. Whatever new medication eventually arrives with its own novel mechanism and its own unexamined exit process. The lesson of Effexor isn't really about this one specific drug at all in the end. It's about how long it can take institutional medicine to catch up to what the people actually taking a medication already know from lived experience, and how much unnecessary suffering accumulates in that gap. One missed dose, one dismissed symptom, one forum post at a time, until finally, gradually, the knowledge outgrows its own neglect and the record is finally properly set straight. Somewhere between the brain zaps and the tapering charts, a quieter side effect was accumulating pound by pound, rarely discussed in the same urgent tone as withdrawal, but no less frustrating for the people living through it. Some patients found their appetite shifting subtly over months, cravings appearing at odd hours, a slow creep on the scale that seemed to have nothing to do with diet or exercise. Doctors debated the mechanism. Patients just wanted their old metabolism back, and Effexor, as usual, was in no hurry to give anything back quickly. The relationship between antidepressants and weight has always been a genuinely complicated area of psychiatric medicine, resistant to the kind of tidy, universal explanation patients understandably wish existed. Effexor's effect on weight isn't as consistently documented as, say, certain older antidepressant classes known for more dramatic and predictable weight gain. Some patients on Effexor report weight loss, particularly in the earlier stages of treatment, tied partly to appetite suppression that sometimes accompanies its energizing norepinephrine-driven effects. Others, particularly with longer-term use, report a gradual weight increase that seems to defy any change in their actual eating or exercise habits, a frustrating mismatch between effort and outcome that left many patients feeling like their own body had quietly renegotiated its terms without informing them. Part of the explanation likely involves the medication's broad influence on appetite-regulating neurotransmitter systems, the same serotonin and norepinephrine pathways responsible for mood, also playing meaningful roles in hunger signaling and metabolic regulation. A medication that adjusts these systems for the explicit purpose of treating depression is, almost inevitably, going to produce some secondary influence on appetite and metabolism as well, simply because these systems don't operate in tidy, separated silos within the brain. Untangling exactly how much of any individual patient's weight change traces back to the medication itself versus other factors, changes in activity level during depression treatment, changes in sleep patterns, general life circumstances, remains genuinely difficult even for researchers specifically studying the question. What made this particular side effect distinctly frustrating for many patients wasn't necessarily its severity compared to other documented effects or complications, but its persistent invisibility in initial consultations. Physicians, focused understandably on the primary treatment goal and the more urgent conversations around dosing and discontinuation, often didn't proactively raise weight as a likely consideration, leaving patients to discover the pattern themselves, gradually, across months of noticing their clothes fitting differently without any clear explanation. By the time many patients connected the dots back to their medication, they'd often already spent considerable energy and frustration pursuing other explanations first. Diet changes, exercise adjustments, none of which fully addressed a shift that had a pharmacological root all along. For patients navigating both this side effect and the broader Effexor withdrawal experience, the weight question adds its own small but meaningful layer of complexity to the decision of whether and when to eventually stop the medication. Some patients report weight normalizing gradually after discontinuation, a small silver lining amid an otherwise difficult process. Others find weight changes persist regardless, another reminder that medication effects don't always resolve themselves neatly along the timeline of the taper itself. It's a modest complication in the grand scope of everything else this particular drug puts patients through, but a real one nonetheless, deserving of a more upfront conversation at the prescribing stage than it has traditionally received. If there's one symptom Effexor patients bond over almost as quickly as brain zaps, it's the sweating, sudden, drenching, entirely unrelated to temperature or exertion. Night sweats that soak through sheets. Daytime episodes that arrive during meetings with all the subtlety of a fire alarm. Nobody warns you that an antidepressant might turn your own thermostat against you, yet here you are, changing shirts twice before lunch and wondering if this is somehow normal. It is, technically. It is also deeply unglamorous. Excessive sweating, known clinically as hyperhidrosis when it reaches a certain threshold, shows up with notable frequency among Effexor's documented side effect profile, tied again largely to its norepinephrine activity. since this particular neurotransmitter system plays a direct role in regulating the body's sweat glands as part of the broader fight-or-flight response network. A medication actively boosting norepinephrine activity throughout the body, not just within the specific brain regions relevant to mood, inevitably produces some spillover effects in other norepinephrine-sensitive systems, and the sweat glands, it turns out, are considerably more sensitive to this spillover than most patients would ever have guessed before experiencing it directly. The practical impact of this symptom, while rarely dangerous in any medical sense, carries a particular kind of social and psychological burden that's easy to underestimate from the outside. Patients describe carefully curating their wardrobe around darker colours and more forgiving fabrics, keeping spare shirts at the office, developing an almost tactical awareness of which meeting rooms tend to run warmer, all in service of managing a symptom that has nothing to do with actual temperature and everything to do with an overactive internal alarm system their medication had quietly installed. Night sweats added their own separate complication, disrupting already fragile sleep patterns, sometimes waking patients entirely, requiring a change of sheets or pyjamas in the middle of the night, a small but genuinely exhausting ritual repeated across enough nights to wear down anyone's patience. What made this symptom particularly frustrating for many patients was how rarely it came up in initial prescribing conversations, treated by the broader medical literature as a relatively minor, easily tolerated side effect compared to the more clinically significant concerns doctors were trained to prioritize discussing. From a purely clinical risk perspective, this prioritization made some sense. Excessive sweating genuinely doesn't carry the same medical urgency as, say, a serious cardiac side effect worth flagging prominently. But clinical insignificance doesn't translate to lived insignificance, and patients navigating months or years of unpredictable, socially awkward sweating episodes understandably wished this particular consequence had been mentioned with a bit more emphasis before they started the medication rather than discovered independently, usually at the least convenient possible moment. Some patients found modest relief through specific antiperspirant formulations, adjusted room temperatures, or simply strategic wardrobe planning, small accommodations that didn't solve the underlying cause but made the day-to-day experience somewhat more manageable. Others found the symptom improved gradually over time on a stable dose, part of the broader pattern of the body adjusting to a new chemical baseline, even for side effects that never fully disappeared entirely. Either way, it remains one of the more universally, almost comically relatable complaints among the broader Effexor patient community, a symptom that sounds almost too undignified to take seriously until you're the one standing in a work bathroom at 11 in the morning wondering why your body has apparently decided this is the moment for a completely unprompted sauna session. Among the symptoms patients report least often to their doctors and most often to each other are the sexual side effects, a broad and uncomfortable category ranging from diminished desire to complete numbness where sensation used to be. This wasn't unique to Effexor among antidepressants, but its dual-action mechanism seemed to hit this particular department especially hard for some patients. Conversations about it remained hushed for years, mostly because nobody had built comfortable language for discussing what a pill had quietly rearranged in the bedroom. Sexual side effects represent one of the most consistently underreported categories across the entire antidepressant class, not because they are uncommon, but because the combination of personal embarrassment, limited appointment time, and a general cultural discomfort discussing sexual function openly with a physician creates significant barriers to honest disclosure. studies attempting to measure the true prevalence of these side effects across serotonin and norepinephrine affecting medications have consistently found considerably higher rates when researchers ask directly and specifically compared to the rates that emerge from patients spontaneously volunteering the information during a standard appointment. This gap between actual prevalence and reported prevalence means the true scope of the issue likely remained underestimated in official literature for a considerable stretch of the medication's history. The specific mechanism connects once again to the same dual neurotransmitter action that made Effexor clinically effective in the first place. Serotonin activity, when significantly elevated, is well documented to dampen sexual desire and delay or prevent orgasm for a meaningful percentage of patients across nearly every medication in this broader category. Effexor's additional norepinephrine activity doesn't reliably counteract this serotonin effect, the way some patients and even some physicians initially hoped it might, and for many patients the combination produces sexual side effects at rates comparable to, or in some reported cases exceeding, those seen with SSRIs alone. What made this particular chapter of the Effexor story especially difficult to address wasn't primarily a lack of clinical data, though better data would certainly have helped, but a broader cultural silence that made the conversation harder to have even once the data existed. Patients frequently describe feeling embarrassed raising the topic with their prescribing physician, worried about seeming vain or ungrateful for raising a quality of life concern, while managing what might be a considerably more serious underlying mental health condition. Physicians, for their part, sometimes fail to proactively ask whether from their own discomfort with the topic, genuine time constraints during a typical appointment, or simply an assumption that patients would raise it themselves if it was significantly bothering them, an assumption the data suggest was frequently incorrect. This silence had real consequences beyond simple discomfort. Some patients, unwilling to raise the issue directly, discontinued the medication entirely without informing their physician of the actual reason, sometimes reporting a vague sense that the medication wasn't quite right, rather than specifying the actual symptom driving their decision. This meant physicians occasionally lost valuable feedback that might have led to a dose adjustment, a switch to a different medication with a more favourable sexual side effect profile, or simply an informed conversation about whether the trade-off was worth continuing. As awareness grew, gradually, partly through the same patient forums and gradually shifting cultural openness discussed throughout this story, more physicians began proactively raising the topic during routine check-ins, treating sexual function as a legitimate quality of life metric worth tracking alongside mood and anxiety symptoms, rather than an awkward afterthought best left unspoken unless the patient forced the issue themselves. The withdrawal side of this particular symptom category carries its own separate, less commonly discussed wrinkle worth mentioning here. For some patients, sexual side effects that persisted throughout their time on the medication didn't simply resolve the moment the taper began, and in a smaller subset of cases symptoms lingered well beyond the point where every other withdrawal effect had settled back to baseline. This phenomenon, sometimes referenced informally as persistent sexual dysfunction following antidepressant use, remains genuinely contested within the research community, with some researchers viewing it as a real, distinct, and understudied condition, and others viewing reported cases as more likely explained by underlying psychological factors, relationship dynamics, or the residual effects of the original condition the medication had been treating in the first place. Patients living through this particular uncertainty describe a frustration similar in shape to what protracted withdrawal patients describe elsewhere in this story, a lived experience that doesn't fit neatly into the timeline. The rest of the literature suggests it should follow, met with a research base too thin and too contested to offer much beyond cautious acknowledgement that more studies needed. What ties this entire chapter together in the end is less about the specific biology of any one neurotransmitter system, and more about the broader pattern this story keeps returning to again and again. A category of very real, very consequential patient experience that institutional medicine was simply slow to take seriously, not out of malice, but out of a combination of cultural discomfort, limited appointment time, and a research infrastructure not originally designed to capture symptoms patients felt too embarrassed to volunteer without being asked directly. Sexual health, it turns out, deserves the same careful, proactive attention within psychiatric care that brain zaps and sleep disruption eventually received, and the fact that it took this long to get there says less about the importance of the symptom itself and more about how selectively medicine has historically decided which forms of patient discomfort are worth asking about out loud. As Effexor grew more common, so did the practice of combining it with other medications, mood stabilizers, sleep aids, anti-anxiety prescriptions layered on top like architectural additions to an already complicated structure. Each addition brought its own withdrawal considerations, its own interactions, its own tapering math. Patients on multiple medications often found that untangling which symptom belonged to which drug during a taper became a kind of grim detective work, one nobody had properly trained them to do. Psychiatric treatment for complex cases rarely involves a single medication in isolation, particularly for patients managing multiple overlapping conditions. Depression alongside anxiety, alongside insomnia, alongside any number of other complicating factors that make a single, tidy prescription insufficient to address the full clinical picture. Effexor frequently found itself prescribed as part of a broader medication regimen, rather than as a standalone treatment, combined with sleep aids to address the insomnia that either preceded treatment or emerged as a side effect, combined with anti-anxiety medications for breakthrough symptoms, occasionally combined with mood stabilizers for patients whose diagnostic picture included features beyond straightforward depression. This layered approach to treatment, while often clinically sound and genuinely helpful for managing complex symptom profiles, introduced a particular complication once the time came to consider discontinuing any single component of the overall regimen. Withdrawal symptoms from Effexor specifically don't announce themselves with a helpful label, distinguishing them from symptoms that might be emerging from a separate medication, also undergoing adjustment, or from the underlying condition itself reasserting its presence as multiple treatment shifts simultaneously. A patient tapering Effexor while also adjusting a sleep medication, for instance, faces the genuinely difficult task of trying to determine which specific symptom traces back to which specific chemical change, a puzzle considerably more complex than the already challenging process of tapering a single medication in isolation. Physicians managing these more complex tapering scenarios generally recommend adjusting one medication at a time wherever clinically feasible, allowing enough stabilization period between changes to more clearly attribute any emerging symptoms to the most recent adjustment rather than to some ambiguous combination of multiple simultaneous changes. This approach, while sound in principle, isn't always practical given real-world constraints. Insurance considerations around appointment frequency, patient impatience to complete the entire process more quickly, or simply the genuine complexity of certain clinical pictures where sequential, one-at-a-time changes aren't always feasible without risking destabilization elsewhere in the treatment plan. Patients navigating this particular complication often found the support communities discussed earlier especially valuable, since forum members frequently shared their own experience distinguishing between different medications, specific withdrawal signatures, brain zaps more characteristic of Effexor specifically, rebound anxiety more characteristic of certain anti-anxiety medications, sleep disruption that could plausibly stem from either category, depending on the specific drugs involved. This peer-generated differential diagnosis, informal and unofficial as it remained, often provided patients with a more practical framework for understanding their own complex symptom picture than they were able to piece together during necessarily brief clinical appointments. Another small but meaningful example of patients building their own expertise in the gaps left by an institutional system still catching up to the full complexity of the treatment landscapes it had itself created. The problem compounds further when benzodiazepines enter the picture specifically, a combination that became common enough in psychiatric practice to deserve its own dedicated mention. Benzodiazepines carry their own well-documented, sometimes severe withdrawal profile, entirely separate from anything Effexor produces, and patients tapering both medications simultaneously, whether by their own choice or simply because their treatment plan called for addressing both at once, faced a genuinely daunting overlap of symptoms: physical tremor, rebound anxiety, sleep disruption, and cognitive fog that could plausibly originate from either substance or from some combination of both, interacting in ways neither medication alone would produce. Physicians experienced in this particular intersection generally recommend stabilizing and completing a benzodiazepine taper before beginning any significant adjustment to Effexor, given how much more established and how much more dangerous unmanaged benzodiazepine withdrawal can become compared to SNRI discontinuation. But this sequencing isn't always followed in practice, particularly in cases where the original prescribing physician wasn't the same person overseeing the eventual taper. Sleep medications introduced a subtler version of the same layering problem, since many sleep aids commonly prescribed alongside Effexor carry mild dependency and rebound insomnia risks of their own, meaning a patient attempting to taper off both medications simultaneously might experience a compounding sleep disruption considerably worse than either medication would produce on its own. This created something of a vicious cycle for patients already struggling with the insomnia symptoms characteristic of Effexor withdrawal specifically, caught between two separate chemical systems both demanding a slow, careful exit at exactly the moment they most needed reliable rest. Untangling this particular knot required considerable patience, often an extended timeline stretching well beyond what either medication would have needed in isolation, and a physician willing to think through the sequencing carefully rather than defaulting to whichever standard taper schedule happened to be sitting in the reference materials for each drug considered separately. This entire layered complication also raises a quieter, more structural question worth naming plainly about how psychiatric care tends to accumulate medications over time without always building in a corresponding plan for eventually simplifying that regimen again. A patient's treatment history often expands gradually across years, a medication added here for a specific breakthrough symptom, another added there for a sleep problem that emerged along the way, each addition reasonable in isolation, until the patient finds themselves managing a combination considerably more complex than anyone originally intended, with no single physician necessarily holding the complete picture of how all the pieces fit together or how they might eventually be unwound. Addressing this pattern more proactively, treating medication simplification as an ongoing goal worth revisiting periodically rather than an afterthought reserved for whenever a patient finally decides they want to reduce their overall pill burden, represents one of the more practical, achievable improvements available to psychiatric practice going forward, one that would meaningfully ease exactly the kind of tangled multi-symptom detective work described throughout this particular chapter. In the years following Effexor's rocky reputation, pharmaceutical companies grew noticeably more cautious about how new SNRIs were marketed, framing withdrawal risk earlier, building tapering guidance directly into prescribing information, rather than leaving doctors to discover it through patient complaints. It was, in its own quiet way, an entire drug class learning from one very public, very uncomfortable lesson, even if the lesson arrived roughly a decade later than anyone experiencing brain zaps at 2 a.m. would have preferred. Pharmaceutical marketing and regulatory submission practices evolved noticeably in the years following Effexor's accumulating discontinuation controversy, a shift that becomes clear when comparing the original prescribing information from the early 90s against the considerably more detailed and cautious language accompanying later SNRI medications entering the market. Newer compounds arrived with discontinuation warnings built into their initial labeling, rather than added retroactively years after approval. Tapering recommendations included as standard guidance from the outset, rather than developed gradually through years of accumulated patient complaints and slowly revised professional consensus. This shift reflects a broader, quietly significant change in how pharmaceutical companies and regulatory bodies approach the entire category of psychiatric medications with complex discontinuation profiles, treating withdrawal potential as a factor worth investigating and disclosing proactively during the initial approval process, rather than as a secondary concern to be addressed only after real-world patient experience revealed a problem serious enough to demand attention. Whether this shift emerged primarily from genuine ethical reconsideration within the industry, from defensive positioning against the kind of litigation and reputational damage Effexor had accumulated, or from a combination of both motivations operating simultaneously, is difficult to determine with any real precision from the outside. The practical outcome, regardless of underlying motivation, benefited patients considerably, arriving at treatment with far more realistic expectations than the earliest Effexor patients had ever been given the chance to hold. This evolution extended beyond simple labeling changes into the broader culture of psychiatric prescribing itself. Physicians training during and after this period absorbed a considerably more nuanced understanding of discontinuation as a legitimate clinical concern deserving proactive planning, baked into their education in a way it simply hadn't been for the physicians who'd originally prescribed Effexor back when the entire concept of severe SNRI withdrawal remained essentially undocumented. Patients starting any new SNRI medication today benefit, whether they realize it or not, from this entire accumulated history, an improved standard of care built directly on the difficult, poorly supported experiences of Effexor's earliest patients, who had no such improved standard available to protect them. There's something worth sitting with in this final observation, a quiet, somewhat bitter-sweet closing note to the entire Effexor story. The patients who suffered most under this medication's original, poorly understood discontinuation profile weren't merely victims of an unfortunate gap in medical knowledge. They were, in retrospect, the unwitting and uncompensated researchers whose accumulated experience eventually improved the standard of care for every patient who came after them, on this medication and on its chemical descendants alike. It's not the kind of contribution anyone would choose to make voluntarily, measured in sleepless nights and unexplained electrical jolts, rather than in laboratory data or clinical trial design. But it was, in the end, a genuinely significant contribution nonetheless, one that deserves acknowledgement even now, decades later, long after the worst of the brain zaps have finally, mercifully faded into memory. It's worth asking, too, what this entire pattern suggests about how the pharmaceutical industry approaches risk disclosure more broadly, beyond just this one drug class. Effexor wasn't the first medication to reveal a significant safety consideration only after widespread real-world use, and it certainly won't be the last. What made its particular story so instructive in hindsight was the specific combination of factors involved, a genuinely novel mechanism that outpaced the existing framework for anticipating discontinuation risk. a short half-life that made the consequences of that gap arrive quickly and dramatically rather than subtly, and a patient population large enough and vocal enough, once they found each other, to eventually force the issue into the open despite years of institutional hesitation. Future medications entering genuinely novel pharmacological territory would do well to treat this specific combination of risk factors, novel mechanism plus rapid clearance plus broad patient population, as a flag worth investigating proactively during the approval process itself, rather than waiting for the same painful, patient-driven correction to play out all over again. There's also a broader question worth raising, honestly, before closing this chapter, about whether the industry has genuinely internalized this lesson, or simply become more careful about the language used in labeling, while the underlying incentive structure, prioritizing speed to market and near-term efficacy data over long-term discontinuation research, remains largely unchanged. Improved warning labels represent real, measurable progress for patients navigating treatment today, and that progress shouldn't be minimized. But labels alone don't guarantee that the next genuinely novel psychiatric compound, whatever mechanism it eventually employs, will receive the kind of rigorous, proactive discontinuation research this entire story suggests should have accompanied Effexor from its very first day on the market. That question remains open, and answering it honestly probably requires watching closely to see how the next truly novel medication story unfolds. Whether the institutional memory built through decades of Effexor's difficult history actually changes behavior at the research and approval stage, or whether it simply changes the wording on a label, while the deeper structural incentives quietly stay the same. So there it is, the full, strange, decades-long story of a little pill that worked exactly as promised, and then made leaving considerably harder than anyone ever warned you it would be. You've walked through the chemistry, the marketing, the half-life that made goodbyes so abrupt, the brain zaps nobody could quite explain, and the quiet, unpaid army of patients who figured out the answers to their own suffering years before medicine caught up and started listening properly. There's something almost tender buried underneath all of it when you sit back and look at the whole shape of the thing. People, exhausted and confused and often frightened, reaching out to strangers on forums with names too cheerful for what they actually contained, trading tapering schedules and brain zap survival tips at 3 a.m, simply because nobody else was going to do it for them. That's not a small thing. That's resilience. Quiet and undramatic and mostly invisible. The same kind of resilience that's kept people upright through every hard chapter of medical history we've ever covered on this channel. Think back for a moment to that first patient in 1993, sitting in an unfamiliar waiting room, filling out paperwork with a pen that kept skipping, trusting a system that had every reason, on paper, to be trusted. She didn't know she was one of the earliest people alive taking a chemical nobody had yet learned to say goodbye to gracefully. She just wanted to feel better, the way anyone filling out that kind of paperwork wants to feel better, the way you probably have wanted to feel better at some low, exhausted point in your own life, whether or not a prescription pad was ever involved. That's the quiet human center of this entire 3-decade story. Buried underneath all the pharmacology and the lawsuits and the slowly revised guidelines, somebody just wanted to feel like themselves again. And for a great many people, this particular medication actually delivered on that promise. It's worth sitting with that fact one more time before we let the story rest completely, because it would be easy, after several hours of brain zaps and lawsuits and insurance denials, to walk away from tonight's episode with an unfairly lopsided impression, as though Effexor was simply a mistake dressed up as medicine. It wasn't. For patients who had tried everything else, who had sat through years of half measures and side effects and disappointment, This was, for a meaningful number of them, the thing that finally worked. That matters. It matters enough that it shouldn't get quietly erased underneath the very real difficulty of the exit, because both things live inside the same story, comfortably uncomfortable, the way most honest medical history tends to be once you look closely enough. So tonight, as you sink into your own bed, no zaps buzzing behind your eyes, no mystery sweat soaking through your shirt, no chemical negotiation happening anywhere in your skull, maybe take one slow breath and let yourself feel a little grateful. Grateful for whatever quiet stability you happen to have right now. Grateful for the decades of patients who turn their own discomfort into knowledge the rest of us get to borrow for free. And grateful simply for the plain and unglamorous miracle of an ordinary, uneventful night. Because medicine is messy and slow and occasionally more honest about its mistakes than about its successes. But it keeps moving forward anyway, one difficult, hard-won lesson at a time. There's a particular kind of comfort in that thought, if you let it settle for a moment. Nothing about how this story unfolded was clean or fast or particularly flattering to any single institution involved, and yet here we are, decades later, with considerably better guidance, considerably more honest labelling, and considerably more compassionate physicians than existed for that very first wave of patients navigating this medication with no map at all. Progress, in medicine as in most things, rarely arrives as a single triumphant breakthrough. It arrives the way it arrived here, slowly, unglamorously, one frustrated forum post and one revised clinical guideline at a time, until the accumulated weight of all those small, individually unremarkable contributions finally tips the whole system towards something better. If you've made it this far into tonight's episode, and you happen to be someone currently sitting somewhere inside this exact story, midway through a taper, or lying awake wondering whether a strange internal jolt is something to worry about, or simply trying to decide whether now is even the right time to attempt stopping at all, we hope something in tonight's long, winding account offered you a little more clarity than you had walking in. Not certainty, because certainty was never really on offer here. Not for this particular medication. Not for the specific, unpredictable way any individual nervous system decides to respond to change. But clarity, at least, about the shape of what you might be facing, and reassurance that whatever strange sensation you're currently experiencing, someone else has almost certainly experienced something remarkably similar, described it in exhausting detail somewhere, and lived to tell the story on the other side of it. That's really the quiet gift buried inside every one of these long history episodes we make together, whether we're talking about medieval peasants freezing through a brutal winter, or ancient queens navigating the impossible physics of surviving power, or, tonight, ordinary people navigating the impossible physics of leaving a chemical their own brain had quietly rearranged itself around. The details change. The underlying shape of the story rarely does. Someone faces something difficult, mostly alone at first, and slowly, through persistence and shared experience, and an almost stubborn refusal to simply accept the official explanation as the whole truth, that difficulty becomes a little more survivable, not just for them, but for everyone who comes after them carrying the same burden. There's a specific kind of quiet heroism in that pattern, one that rarely gets a statue or a headline. The heroism of simply describing your own experience honestly and consistently enough, for long enough, that eventually the people with the power to change things have no choice but to listen. That's what happened here, across thousands of separate, uncoordinated forum posts and doctor's appointments and support group meetings, each one small and unremarkable on its own, each one part of a much larger, slower correction that eventually reshaped how an entire class of medication gets prescribed, marketed, and eventually left behind. Nobody involved in that slow correction thought of themselves as a pioneer while it was happening. They just wanted the zapping to stop and the sleep to return and their own sense of self to feel steady again. The pioneering came later, in hindsight, once the pattern of their collective persistence became visible enough for the rest of us to name it properly. It's worth remembering too, as you drift towards sleep tonight, that stories like this one rarely end with a tidy, permanent resolution. Effexor's chapter in psychiatric history isn't fully closed. Patients are still starting this medication tonight, somewhere, hopeful and uncertain in exactly the way that first patient back in 1993 once was. Other patients are tapering off it tonight, carefully, patiently, following protocols built from decades of accumulated lessons that simply didn't exist for the people who came before them. And somewhere out there, a new medication with its own entirely novel mechanism is quietly making its way through the same approval pipeline that once waved this one through with such uncomplicated enthusiasm, carrying its own undiscovered discontinuation profile that nobody has yet had the reason or the data to properly investigate. None of this is meant to leave you with worry weighing on your chest as you settle in for the night. Quite the opposite, really. It's meant as a kind of gentle, steady reassurance that whatever difficult chemical negotiation you or someone you love might be navigating right now, you're joining a very long, very human lineage of people who have faced something similarly strange and disorienting, and found their way through it, slowly, with patience, with community, with the kind of stubborn persistence that rarely feels heroic in the moment but looks, from enough distance, exactly like courage. So let the day close now, gently, the way we always try to close these evenings together. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they have been holding tension. Let your breathing slow into something closer to the rhythm sleep actually requires. Whatever chemical conversation might be happening quietly inside your own skull tonight, let it happen without your active participation for a while. You've done enough thinking for tonight. You've absorbed 30 long threads of pharmacology, history, and quiet human persistence, and that's more than enough weight for one evening's mind to carry gracefully into rest. Thank you, as always, for spending these hours with us, for letting this particular strange corner of medical history keep you company through whatever kind of night you're having, restless or calm, ordinary or difficult, easy or hard won. If tonight's episode found its way to you because someone in the comments once suggested it, our genuine, heartfelt thanks go out to them specifically and personally, because these episodes only ever happen when people like you keep telling us what's still worth exploring in the dark, quiet hours nobody else seems particularly interested in filling, and if you found real comfort, real information, or even just a quiet sense of company in tonight's long account, we'd be genuinely grateful whenever you have the energy for it. If you'd consider leaving that thought somewhere, we can see it. Like, a comment, whatever small gesture feels right and true to you, though only ever if it feels genuine and never once out of any obligation to us. We'll be back again soon, with another strange, overlooked corner of history waiting to be gently pulled apart and laid out plainly, the way we've tried to do with this one. Until then, rest well. Let the room stay dim a little longer. Let the fan keep humming its soft, steady white noise into the corners of the room. And let whatever chemistry is currently happening inside your own remarkable, resilient body simply continue doing its quiet work, uninterrupted, while you finally, fully let go. One last small thought before we go. Somewhere tonight, another person is lying awake with their own version of this exact story, their own strange sensation, their own quiet worry about whether what they're feeling is normal. You'll never meet them, and they'll never know you existed either, but in some small, real sense, you're keeping each other company simply by both existing inside the same long, ongoing human effort to understand our own bodies a little better than we did yesterday. That's not nothing, and it never has been. Hold on to that thought gently now, softly, as your eyes finally close and the rest of tonight quietly, patiently takes care of itself. Good night, and truly, sincerely rest well, wherever and whoever you happen to be tonight.